Number 10, Alabama 2024 preseason preview on Good Morning College Football. Hello and welcome to episode 60 of Good Morning College Football. I'm Nicholas Ian Allen of CFP Winning Edge and CampusToCanton.com. Thank you for joining us today as we take a look at, depending on, I guess, your perspective, one of the more underrated teams in our preseason team strength power ranking and team projections. We're talking about, of course, the Alabama Crimson Tide, who come in at number 10 in those current preseason rankings, which is quite different than maybe any year in our history since we started doing this at CFP Winning Edge. But before we get into detail on Alabama, let's talk a little bit about, hey, we're exactly 2 months from the kickoff of the 2024 college football season, 61 days away, but the season week 0 kicks off, of course, on August 24th. And as we record or go live today, of course, it's Monday, June 24th. So it'll be here before we know it. Absolutely. Between now and then, if you're looking for ways to get prepared for the college football season, especially if you are thinking from a fantasy perspective, college fantasy football, the Campus to Canton type of game where you have both a college team and an NFL team in the same league, but then of course also Devy and college football in general. CampusToCanton.com is a great place to get caught up, get access to a ton of tools, rankings, information. Of course, the Campus to Canton YouTube channel, where we very much appreciate everyone who gives us a like. If you rate or review on the Campus to Canton podcast feed, there's more content there just about every day on both the YouTube channel and the podcast feed. But then, of course, we've got written content, as we said, rankings, Discord access to members at CampusToCanton.com. And if you want to take a closer look at some of the CFP Winning Edge databases that we discuss here on these team previews, our returning production database, our team profiles. Today, we're going to have a sneak peek at our 2024 stat projections as well. All of those, access to all 134 team pages and each of those databases are available to our C2C Winning Edge and all 22 tier members at CampusToCanton.com. So please do check that out. We very much appreciate your support there. And before, again, we get to Alabama, just very quickly, a couple of news items. We are still seeing a little bit of transfer news here and there. New Mexico State, former New Mexico State running back Jamani Jones has committed to Vanderbilt. He is the 5th former Aggie who has ended up at Vandy, committed to the Commodores, joining, of course, headliner quarterback Diego Pavia. Eli Stowers, former 4-star quarterback recruit at Texas A&M, who transferred to New Mexico State and has played more of a tight end wide receiver role, likely to continue that at Vandy. But that running back position, there seems to be an opportunity perhaps for Jones, who was a starter the last couple of years for the Aggies. Split time with Star Thomas both seasons, but somebody who could potentially go in, certainly add depth to that running back room, but might end up maybe having a chance to end up starting, quite honestly. So not sure, that he's going to, especially getting this late of a start, be the first running back on the field. We have Cedric Alexander, the true sophomore, projected as the number 1 running back for Vandy right now. But Jones, who joins us, former and now current teammate Michaelan Young, who also transferred from New Mexico State, Chase Gillespie, we had projected at number 2 in that running back pecking order at Vandy prior to Jones, but went ahead and slotted Jones into that number 2 spot. But don't be surprised if he ends up again sharing that role or potentially even emerging as the number 1 running back there for the Commodores, who are starting to look more and more like New Mexico State, which isn't usually the path you take to success. But let's not forget, New Mexico State had a very, very impressive performance in a win over Auburn last season. So some of these guys have certainly succeeded against SEC competition before. Jacquez Robinson headed back to the SEC as well. Robinson spent 3 years at Alabama prior to transferring to Colorado, defensive back. Wasn't a major contributor, major impact player on the defensive side of the ball for the Buffs. But interesting note, anytime, I mean, this is pretty rare, but somebody heads back to the other side of one of the greatest rivalries in college football. So Robinson is now going to see the Iron Bowl from the Auburn side of things, having committed to his former defensive coordinator, Charles Kelly, who's now at Auburn and was previously at Alabama as well. So interesting note there, perhaps might not necessarily again be a major impact player, but always an interesting story when that sort of thing happens. And we don't usually get into all the details of legal issues surrounding players, but there were a couple of arrests for DUI, DWI, that sort of thing. Iowa and Mississippi State both have had those situations over the past weekend. And this time of year, that kind of thing happens, unfortunately, far more than it should. But we will certainly keep an eye out for that sort of thing. Any potential news on the legal front that could impact players potentially being suspended for a game or more early on in the season. Sounds like Iowa has a plan usually to suspend players for one game for this type of infraction. So we'll see how that shakes out and then follow up once we get a few more details. But most of you are probably here to hear some discussion on Alabama, which as we said, and if you've been following along with these team previews, if you have access, if you're a C2C Winning Edge tier member, an All-22 tier member at campus2canton.com, you know that Alabama is number 10 in our preseason power rankings. And that is absolutely on the low side. It is, I think, lower than we have ever had Alabama in our power rankings at any point since starting CFP Winning Edge back prior to the 2018 season. And understandably so. We'll get into some of the numbers, but Alabama still has one of the most talented rosters in college football on paper, even though, legendary head coach Nick Saban has retired. The hire of Kalen DeBoer, when you go out and get a head coach who led his team to the national championship game, that's usually a pretty good sign. DeBoer has won everywhere he has been as a head coach, has had a ton of success as an offensive play caller as well. Is not expected to call the plays, most likely, at Alabama this season. But don't be, it's also, I think, still a possibility, and he will have a lot of input, of course. And this DeBoer offense has certainly excelled in years past as well. Last year, most notably, when Michael Penix turned into one of the most prolific quarterbacks in college football and became a top 10 NFL draft pick. So we'll see what's in store for Jalen Milroe, how the blending of his skill set with the success that DeBoer had. Certainly a little bit of a different player than Penix. And it'll be interesting to see if Milroe is going to be used in some similar ways, if DeBoer and this coaching staff are going to lean more heavily into his rushing ability and some of the aspects of his skill set that are the biggest strengths. But regardless, a lot of change at Alabama. With the, of course, transition from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer, but also, filling that offense out around Jalen Milroe. A lot of new faces and some, pretty key places. And we will, of course, dig into that a little bit later on today. So what are others saying about Alabama at this point? Typically, at least the last couple of weeks between once we got out of that top four, where there is a lot of consensus as to, who are the top 3 or 4 teams in most preseason rankings, whether they are more, analytics, computer-based systems like our team strength power rankings, or whether they are, more of the, human insight analysis piece of the puzzle, like you might see in more of the, preseason magazine type rankings or other online outlets. Usually, or I guess I got used to it once we got between number 5 and number 9 in our power rankings, for our numbers to be somewhat in the middle, to be at least not the absolute highest on a team or the absolute lowest. I think Ole Miss, we were because we have Ole Miss as number 5 in our power rankings at this point. I think we were tied for the highest from what I saw there, but we are now on the extreme end as far as our rankings go on Alabama, and we are on the extreme low end. I didn't necessarily expect that, but going through and we've got nearly a dozen different rankings that I try to gather and sort of see where we fall in order. And at On 3, Andy Staples has Alabama at number 3 in his most recent rankings that we've been referencing. So Andy Staples, of course, one of the best writers of college football in the country, and always got a lot of bright things to say about the game and teams and players. Doesn't see this Crimson Tide program falling very far after the departure of Nick Saban. Stuart Mandel of The Athletic is of a similar mind. He's got Alabama number 4 in his post-spring, spring portal window top 25. Kelly Ford, K Ford ratings, more of a, I think, purely computer-based system, sees a similar Alabama squad, number 4 in the most recent K Ford ratings. Athlon Sports has Alabama number 5 in its preseason magazine. The 2 main computer models at ESPN, Bill Connolly's SP Plus and the Football Power Index, both have Alabama at number 5 as well. Phil Steele sees Alabama at number 6 in his power poll, more of that computer-based system, and number 7 in his rankings prediction. So how well will the teams, fare throughout the course of the season? Where will they, that predicted order of finish? 2 different looks at it from Phil Steele. Beta Rank, the analytics model, has Alabama number 7, as does Mark Schlabach of ESPN. And the closest to us is the Sporting News, which has Alabama number 9. So we are the only folks out there that have Alabama at double digits, basically. And I was perhaps naive to be surprised by that, because of course, there's still a ton of talent. There's a ton of success that this coaching staff has had, even with the transition away from Saban. So we will dig into and discuss why we are lower than seemingly everybody else. Certainly major outlets out there are higher on Alabama than our numbers would indicate. So a few other things. What are people saying? We've been using this portion of the show and each preview to spend some time mostly talking about quarterbacks, and Jalen Milroe is certainly a draft eligible quarterback, so we'll be taking a look at some of the anonymous quotes that Bruce Feldman was able to pick up, the ESPN notes as well, for how Milroe is perhaps expected to project to the next level. David Hale in his piece at ESPN also, where he tiered, ranked by tier all 134 quarterback situations. So starting with Bruce Feldman, who, of course, gives a little bit of detail on Milroe's 2023. We, of course, remember he started week 1, got benched in, prior to that USF game where Alabama struggled so much, and then got the job back and ends up being a top 10 vote getter in the Heisman Trophy by the end of the season, leads Alabama to the playoff, and an SEC championship. Undefeated run, beats Georgia, gets into the playoff, and comes up just short of making a run at another national title game. So Milroe, certainly not a perfect player, a little rough around the edges in some ways, and that's part of what Bruce Feldman found, according to an SEC defensive coordinator. Feldman, quoting here from the piece, says, "They switched to lots of half-field reads last year, and he played pretty well. He has a strong arm and definitely has got a skill set, has speed like Jaden Daniels, but with a much, much thicker build." Another longtime SEC assistant, quoted here in the piece, says, "He looks like a big running back who can throw it well. They figured out what he could handle, and then they took off. They did not have great talent around him, but he made it go because he's such a dynamic running threat, and they got a lot better up front as the season went on. I'm curious to see how he takes to that system. Penix had a ton of experience and has a great arm, and has great arm talent, and could really see it." Jordan Reed of ESPN noted, where does Jalen Milroe excel? He's aggressive throwing down the field, according to Reed. Had 34 completions of 20-plus air yards, which was the 4th highest in the country, according to his research. Was benched in week 3, as we mentioned, but then, of course, led Alabama to the playoff after finishing the season with 2,834 receiving yards, 23 touchdown passes, and 6 interceptions. Reed also mentions that he is a strong and competitive runner, finished with over 500 rushing yards and double-digit touchdowns, excels taken off when the play breaks down around him, and has the ability to threaten defenses up the middle and on the edge. But what are some of Milroe's weaknesses? According to Reed, and reading here from the piece, Milroe lacks consistency on short to intermediate throws due to faulty footwork. That leads to delayed decision-making and unreliable ball placement when he needs to get the ball out quickly. He shows more comfort when afforded time to see things down the field. Reed also calls Milroe overconfident when scrambling, and that can result in taking too many negative plays, taking sacks, things of that nature. Reed said he was sacked at least 4 times in 8 games last season, and must realize he doesn't have a highlight reel play on every down. David Hale of ESPN, who did slot this Alabama quarterback room in the top tier, number 1, tier 1. Jalen Milroe, again, being that leading returner. He was a top 10 in the Heisman Trophy voting last season, but finished 6th, I believe, in that order last year, higher than anyone else returning to college football in 2024. So it makes sense that he was one of the best quarterbacks by the end of the season, even despite some struggles, despite that high profile benching, ended up as one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year. Still had plenty of flaws, as Reed outlined. There's plenty of others out there. If you do a Twitter search on Jalen Milroe, you'll see plenty of other folks with not always the greatest things to say about him. But David Hale outlined some of the reasons why Jalen Milroe and this Alabama quarterback room should be considered tier one. Some notes, some stats that Hale outlined certainly caught my eye. Reading here from that piece said no QB had a higher percentage of his dropbacks come versus zone last season than Milroe, who had 70.2% of his dropback passing attempts against zone coverage last year. Milroe actually thrived versus zone coverage, and in quotes or in parentheses says 11.2 yards per pass, 64.9 raw QB rating, 16 touchdowns and 4 interceptions, and struggled more versus man coverage. So the opposite side of the spectrum here, 8.3 yards per pass, 55.4 raw QBR, 5 TDs, and 2 picks. So as a passer, Milroe versus zone, the numbers indicate he was far better in those situations. But of course, somebody who has Milroe's running ability, if you play man coverage and those defenders take their eyes off the quarterback, that can create some big play opportunities on the ground as well. Hale outlined no returning quarterback in 2024 provided more value per dropback. So he's looking here at expected points added per play, which there's some controversy, some differing opinions on how well that translates to individual players or team stats as a whole. But Hale notes here that only that Jalen Milroe, ranked in the top 4 in that in that stat. I started reading as he wrote. He was actually referencing Dylan Gabriel. Sorry, no QB provided more value than Dylan Gabriel. But next up, Caden Salter, Carson Beck, and then Jalen Milroe. So top 4 in expected points added per play per drop back passing attempt or opportunity. And then there were 15 quarterbacks last season, according to Hale, that averaged double digits in air yards per throw. So one of the things that Milroe certainly does have the ability to do is attack downfield. That group, those 15 quarterbacks, according to Hale, averaged 58% completion on those 10 yards per air throw. Milroe had the highest completion percentage of the group at 65.8%, a full percentage point ahead of number 2 Byron Brown from USF. So there's been some of those negative comments about Milroe are discussing his lack of accuracy in those deep throws. Nevertheless, the numbers indicate Milroe actually performs pretty well when you go beyond 10 yards. So Jalen Milroe is the key to this Alabama offense in my opinion. And we'll get into where else, who else around him is going to be able to step up and make plays. But first, before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about how last year went. We're going to start in our CFB Winning Edge team profiles for Alabama. Let me get off the Vanderbilt page, pull Alabama up here. All right. When we look at post-game win expectancy, we like to do that a lot in these team previews, see how well did this team actually perform when you look at those advanced box scores. If you were to go back, play a game 100 times, 1,000 times, how often would you expect Alabama to win it? And the first most important game that jumps off the screen is that week 2 loss to Texas, where it was a deserved loss. Alabama would have only won that game about a third of the time based on those post-game numbers, based on those box scores. Ended up just weren't able to close the gap, lost 34-24. That USF game was a weird one. Ended up winning 17-3, but Milroe, of course, did not participate, was back on the field for Ole Miss, where Alabama put up another 90-plus post-game number. So even though that was a low-scoring, close game, Alabama controlled it and would have won 92% of the time. Mississippi State was even more impressive. Texas A&M, close game, but Alabama deserved to win that one 3 out of 4 times. Arkansas and Tennessee. That Arkansas game final score is much closer than the stats might indicate, but Tennessee get a 2-touchdown win and an 81% on the post-game number. And then Alabama, by that time was ramping up to, become one of those top teams in college football. Very early on, the loss to Texas, the real shaky performance against USF, it looked like, okay, maybe this Alabama team, and we were pretty low on Alabama last year as well, certainly before being 10th in this season's preseason rankings. Last season was our lowest preseason ranking for Alabama, and I believe it was number 4. They were number 4 in our preseason numbers last year. But by midseason, they had shaken off those early struggles, starting to ramp up and play like one of the best teams in college football. Had a 99% post-game win expectancy number against LSU, and that, of course, just prolific offense with Jaden Daniels leading the way. Alabama held it to 28 points. Solid performance in the grand scheme of things. Really took care of business against Kentucky, FCS opponent Chattanooga. And then, that Auburn game was just an incredible one where it looked like Alabama was not going to be able to get out of there with a win. Milroe finds that connection on 4th down. The Crimson Tide able to survive. The post-game numbers, 85%, don't necessarily indicate how close perhaps Alabama was to losing that one. And then, the Georgia game, we talked about it a little bit in our Georgia preview, where after Georgia took the lead early, Alabama basically controlled it from there on out. Post-game number, 61%, solid performance there. And then even though it was just 2% in the post-game win expectancy number in that Rose Bowl loss to Michigan, that I think is an indication that this Alabama team, even when it didn't play well, like it didn't against Auburn, still was very dangerous, was able to find ways to stay competitive, could have, ended up winning that game, come up just short in overtime against Michigan. But how did they perform on the whole, statistically speaking? When we're looking at our team performance numbers, we give a rating or a grade. I sometimes refer to it as a grade on how well that team played based only on stats. So a lot of the key numbers are listed here in our team profiles as well. Things like scoring margin, net yards per play, net points per drive, that coming from Brian Fremeau, net yards per pass attempt. Those are all against FBS opponents only. The net points per drive is filtered for garbage time, as is net success rate. And then EPA margin, we use an equivalent from collegefootballdata.com for PPA, predicted points added per play. So as you can see, Alabama was a little bit, even though they finished number 7 in our overall team performance numbers, which, if you do look on the far right side of our team profiles, you can sort of see the history in those team performance rankings and ratings. You can see, of course, in 2020, that Alabama team was considered maybe one of the best all time. And there's been a not huge, but fairly consistent step back each year. They were number 2 in 2021, number 4 in 2022, number 3 in 2027, number 7 in 2023. And if you look, stat by stat, and there are dozens more that go into these team performance numbers than just these that are listed here on the page. But these, I think, give a pretty good glimpse at where that overall number might come from. And yards per pass attempt, Alabama was elite. Number 2 in the country on net, number 3 in average yards per pass attempt offensively, top 15 defensively. But everywhere else, this team played a lot more like a top 15 or a top 20 type team. Scoring margin, 15th. And do keep in mind, these are, as I said, against FBS opponents only, but also in the regular season only. And so it doesn't indicate, or doesn't capture Alabama's game against Georgia in the SEC championship game. Also doesn't capture the game against Michigan in the Rose Bowl. That is a little bit of a, it's not a perfect situation for a team like Alabama that played, tough opponents at or close to 100%. But we do want to try to filter out, those other bowl games where there's a bunch of opt-outs and things like that, and just haven't quite gotten to the point where we're able to take it for some teams and not for others. So do keep that in mind as we're looking here. But top 15 in scoring margin, top 25 on the offensive side of the ball, 14th defensively, top 20 in net yards per play. Actually, on the low side on the offensive side, especially where we're used to seeing Alabama, 35th offensively in yards per play, 40th in success rate. So consistency and efficiency, just, picking up chunks of yardage regularly was not necessarily something Alabama excelled at over the course of the regular season. Relied a little bit more on the big passing play, connecting Jalen Milroe on some deep shots, leading to big plays. But defensively, fairly consistent, top 25, just about every category, 23rd in EPA per play allowed, top 10 in success rate allowed. So that defense, not necessarily the opposite, because it's not like Alabama was one of the worst in college football, but that was a little bit more of a strength, was limiting opponents to have to try to attack that Alabama defense on big plays. Take a look now at team performance, or excuse me, my words this morning. I am just stumbling over what I want to say. Returning production. How did this Alabama team shake out as far as returning production? And on the low side, nationally speaking, and this is a number that we're used to seeing Alabama, because if you look, especially on the defensive side of the ball, that bright blue, royal blue number indicates players who left early for the NFL draft. So, 3 years and done. Terrion Arnold, of course, Dallas Turner, Kool-Aid McKinstry, highly drafted players. And we're used to that for Alabama. We are used to seeing, half dozen or so players enter the NFL draft early. J.C. Latham being one on the offensive line as well. But what's different about Alabama as it sort of compares to other teams that are consistently, one, recruiting at an elite level like Alabama does, but also expected to compete for national championships, being top 5 type preseason ranked teams. We've talked a lot about it with Ohio State, with Georgia, Penn State. We're not seeing those types of teams rank in the 90s or triple digits, where we've seen in the past Alabama, Georgia, whoever are just able to shake that off because they've recruited so well. Well, part of it is transfer portal. Part of it is just maybe a few of the teams with those draft eligible quarterbacks. They're able to bring a lot more back this season or fill holes through the transfer portal, seemingly a little bit better maybe than Alabama did or has done in its transition from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer. That was a key question. Of course, it was late in the recruiting cycle in that coaching carousel when that change was made. And we talked about it at the time. We definitely expected to see an uptick in transfers, incoming transfers to Tuscaloosa in the spring. We did, perhaps not quite at the level that I expected. And that ends up working out to a 94th overall ranking in returning production. 55th on the offensive side of the ball, actually top 50 if you were just looking at raw numbers, who's leaving compared to last season. Alabama top 50 on the offensive side of the ball, but defensively 115th in those raw who's coming back, who's not numbers from last season, 118th in those net defensive returning production numbers. So when we take into account incoming transfers as well as players moving on, whether they're out of eligibility, leaving via the transfer portal, or leaving early for the NFL draft, Alabama 118th on the defensive side of the ball. Milroe, of course, is back. That's key. Knocking on the door right there at 10 yards per pass attempt. That is really the goal. I mean, that when I look at, did a quarterback excel, as a passer in a particular game, or it's really difficult to get to 10 over the course of a season, but that's sort of my own sort of benchmark. That's what I look for game by game in particular. But Milroe, did have a 13.4 average depth of target. So the completion percentage, there are certainly, he made some bad throws, some inaccurate throws at times that people would point to online, but connected on a lot of big plays as well, and did a good job stretching the field. So I'm a Jalen Milroe fan, if that hasn't come through yet. The passing numbers overall are good, with the potential, I think, to be even better. But the rushing numbers are really excellent for a quarterback. 531 yards, 12 touchdowns. And that does even account for, because you see that 3.3 average, there's a lot of sacks that are gone in there. That's a big area where Milroe can improve, could end up with 700 plus yards if he's able to get a little bit better, getting rid of the football, not holding it up too long, not taking hits and taking sacks. That number, I think, has room to grow. Jam Miller's the top returner as far as rushing yards and rushing attempts among running backs, but Justice Haynes, the 5-star true freshman last season, is, in my opinion, probably the better of the two, the most likely to be that top running back this season. Although Jam Miller was somebody that we discussed in spring practice reports, had an excellent spring according to those watching and close to the action. So it could potentially be a fairly even split as well. At wide receiver, Jermaine Burton is off to the NFL. Isaiah Bond and Amari Niblack are off to Texas. That leaves Kobe Prentice as the top player returning in terms of wide receiver targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns. CJ Dippery back at tight end, who was, clearly the number 2 option among tight ends behind Niblack, but does have, I think, plenty of talent and the ability to take a step forward there as well. The addition of Jeremy Bernard from Washington will be key. He had a huge spring, big play, plenty of highlights, plenty of buzz surrounding his performance in the spring game, but there's production there to back it up as well. In what was if not the one of the very best wide receiver cores last season, 3 players drafted. Bernard back, looks like he's in line to be that top target for Jalen Milroe this season. Jalen Hale, unfortunately, is going to be sidelined, if not the entire season, for quite a bit, it sounds like. I don't think we got any official word one way or the other on what his knee injury was, but there are plenty of reports and some quotes coming out of spring practice that he's going to be sidelined for a while. So who's going to step up and be that playmaker, alongside Bernard and Prentice? Could Kendrick Law step up? We currently have Law as a projected starter. True freshman Ryan Williams, Emmanuel Henderson, who's fully a wide receiver after beginning his career at running back, or could another true freshman like Caleb Odom, who was listed as a tight end among some recruiting sites, but is a wide receiver on the roster, 6'5", 220, somebody we talked about this spring as well, that adds a real matchup. It could potentially be a matchup problem in the red zone, especially, but add some size that the rest of that Alabama wide receiver core doesn't really have. Offensive line wise, we mentioned Latham gone, Seth McLaughlin, who struggled with snaps at the end of last season. There's been some blame back and forth on different reporting. Was that Milroe's fault? That's certainly something to consider. But to my perhaps untrained eye, seemed like McLaughlin was really the one struggling there. But 3 starters are back. The big one, Caden Proctor, former 5-star who actually transferred out after Saban retired, spent the spring at Iowa. He is back in Tuscaloosa and expected to reclaim that starting spot at left tackle. Tyler Booker, the left guard, is back, as is Jaden Roberts, who started 9 games at right guard last season. Add in Parker Brailsford, who is very experienced at center. He was limited a lot this spring, still a little bit unclear exactly what was what held him out at times. Curious to see how his availability looks this fall, but also late addition Gino Van DeMark, who had 6 starts at Michigan State last season, and of course, plenty of talent elsewhere as well. Caleb Downs, in my opinion, I've said it plenty, maybe the best player in college football, regardless of position. All-American as a true freshman, leading tackler, just a huge loss. Cannot simply replace a player like Caleb Downs. Terrion Arnold was just as good. Perhaps even as an advanced player, one could argue was better in some ways. Losing out on the starters at all 3 levels, guys like Justin Ebugbe, Jalen Key, Tresman Marshall, Chris Braswell out of eligibility, or played their full 4 years and then moving on to the NFL. But Dallas Turner, yet another just incredibly prolific pass rusher, 55 pressures last season, just 1 fewer than Braswell. But I mean, if you have 25 pressures, you're having an excellent year, being very disruptive as a pass rusher. And to, those 2 players combining for 110, that's going to be difficult. Kool-Aid McKinstry, of course, as well, highly rated corner last season. But as you can see, there's some light blue mixed in as well. Incoming transfers: Deshaun Jones, Damani Jackson, Keon Saab, LT Overton, King Mack there as well. So Alabama, embracing sort of the new way of doing things in college football, is having to try to figure out how to fill those potentially starting spots. We're just used to seeing 5-star recruits, 4-star recruits waiting their turn and getting slotted in. That's not necessarily the case anymore, even at Alabama. So how does all this shake out as far as what we expect to see in 2024? Our Alabama projections, going back to the team profiles, we've mentioned a lot of what we expect to see as far as that depth chart goes with Milroe. We have Justice Haynes pegged as the top running back, but he and Miller, I think, very, very even at this point, and Miller a little more experienced last year. Bernard, Law, and Prentice are our top wideouts, but a couple of key freshmen there on the second level: Ryan Williams, Caleb Oden. Curious to see if Emmanuel Henderson can capitalize on what made him one of the highest rated running back recruits in the country in 2022. There we have Parker Brailsford listed as the starting center. That may or may not be the case. We'll certainly keep an eye on how things are shaken out in spring practice, but the addition of DeMarc and Nikhil Bertrand, as well as incoming transfers, add some depth to that offensive line unit. On the defensive side of the ball, even though the overall returning production numbers are not great, there is experience, multiple starters on both the defensive line and at linebacker. Tim Keenan, the third, kind of steps up to become that next maybe really productive player just based on his pressures last season. Pretty remarkable for a nearly 340-pound defensive lineman, but can still get after the quarterback, not just a run stopper. But then, of course, Deontay Lawson, Jod Campbell, Malachi Moore, a little bit of a surprise to get him back for yet another season. He's over a 100 rated player, and our individual player ratings broke through that 99 or 100 threshold that you might see in the video games. We decided a couple of years ago not to cap it anymore. So Moore is certainly one of those players who's incredibly productive, 33 career starts, over 50 games, but has put up some good numbers as well. The rest of that secondary, though, is a little bit of a concern as far as inexperience or just having to bring in players from elsewhere. Damani Jackson certainly got plenty of experience and was a 5-star player when he signed out of USC a couple of years ago. Keon Saab was in line to start for the defending national champions in Michigan, did have 5 starts for the Wolverines last year and was productive, but just, I don't know, still for me, it's taken some getting used to for those Alabama defensive backs, the secondary there in Tuscaloosa, to have to rely on incoming transfers from elsewhere. So to me, that doesn't necessarily scream strength, but could be wrong. Nevertheless, that unit does grade out pretty well, top 15 nationally in our position strength ratings. So when we look at raw recruiting ratings here on this left-hand side, when I'm talking about those raw talent numbers, Alabama is still among the best as far as bringing in high school talent from across the country. Average 247 composite rating at the quarterback position, number 2. Running back, number 1. Wide receiver, number 1. Offensive skill as a whole, number 1. Top 5 in the offensive line. And then on the defensive side of the ball, just as good. Number 1 D-line, number 2 linebacker, number 4 in the secondary. But when we adjust those numbers for experience and returning production, that's where our numbers don't like this Alabama roster quite as much compared to the other teams in the top 10. Milroe, I think, has a great ceiling, but you can see here there are 10 other quarterback rooms that come out higher rated in our position strength ratings. The running back room might quickly emerge as a top 10 room in college football. But right now, Jam Miller, Justice Haynes, and the rest of that unit, there's just not, a firmly established track record at the college level like there is with maybe teams that rank a little bit higher. And there are 42 other running back rooms that are position strength ratings, like a little bit more on paper. That might change a lot. Maybe Justice Haynes comes out, has 5 straight 100-yard games. Jam Miller could, be just as good if he were given the opportunity. So maybe that running back room at the end of the season is a top 10 position in college football. But at this point, they're outside the top 40 in our numbers. Wide receiver room, very similar. Outside the top 20 right now. And I would say I feel a little less confident in the wide receiver room than I do the running back room. But Milroe, he's going to be connecting with Jeremy Bernard, going to be connecting with Kobe Prentice on some big plays, touchdowns. I'm sure there are some, 100-yard performances coming for that wide receiver unit that also might very quickly, we might be grading them out as a top 10 wide receiver unit based on production once those players really do get the opportunity to show what they can do. Nevertheless, right now, 21st. Tight end room outside the top 50. That doesn't rate super high in our roster strength numbers. Just tight end, kind of a difficult position to account for their overall impact, because most of the ways we can gauge production is based on receiving. And of course, we know tight ends are key blockers as well. But top 10 offensive line, the addition of Proctor really helped with that. And we're also counting again on Brailsford being back fully available this spring. But that could be a real strength after a couple of years and early last season, especially where that offensive line struggled at times, was a real question mark. Got better and better as the season went on. This year, perhaps the offensive line, in addition to Jalen Milroe, going to be a real strength of this Alabama offense. Defensively, same story. That defensive line might end up by when all is said and done, as a top 10, maybe even top 5 unit in college football. But right now we see it as a little bit more of top 25 type level, based in part on just not as much experience, not as much production coming back as some of the other higher rated units. Linebacker core, 11th. Defensive backfield, 13th. We're used to seeing ones, 2s, 3s, 5s on the lowest position groups. The first 4 or 5 years we did this, that's what we saw even when Alabama would rank 94th in returning production, or sometimes even lower. It was still pretty consistent that our position strength ratings were much higher on Alabama. But the way other teams are able to fill slots, in Ohio State, for example, brings back a lot of guys who could have been drafted on the defensive side of the ball last season, and then adds arguably the best player in college football in Caleb Downs, they're going to rank higher. Teams like Oregon in some of these position groups who are even more aggressive in the transfer portal rank higher at some of these key positions. Alabama has embraced adding players from elsewhere the last couple of years, but still, once our numbers are all put against one another, teams position by position and how they grade out, Alabama's a little lower than we're used to. Okay, last thing before we really dig into the win total projections, I want to give a brief sort of sneak peek at our stat projection. So I mention the team profiles, mention the returning production database often, and those are available to our C2C Winning Edge and all 22 tier members. The stat projections are the last thing on our off-season to-do list as far as the big database piece of the puzzle. And they will be available again to those all 22 and C2C Winning Edge tier members in July. We're trying to make sure that we've got all of our notable player projections available for the CFF guide, the Campus to Canton CFF guide, which will be available in early July. But you'll get access to all these team pages in early or mid-July for those appropriate tiers. But this is, a lot of information, a lot of numbers packed in. We give history on, the team itself, team record, who was the play caller, dating back all the way to 2006, and then coach history. So team by team, here's where we're seeing a lot of changes. If Kalen DeBoer is somebody you're not, super familiar with, you can look through, see where he's been, where, how well those teams have performed. Look at those Sioux Falls teams at the latter half of, that first decade of the 2000s. Just an incredible track record of success there at the NAIA level. Moves up to Division I, and see what, of course, he has done in just the last couple of years, building Washington into a national title contender. But we've got offensive and defensive stats, team performance, those net, key stats that we look at, some other ones as well that aren't mentioned there, things like touchdown rate, havoc rate, points per opportunity. We adjust for sacks and things like that to give you an adjusted run pass percentage. Our pace projections are in here. We break it out in individual positions. You can see how the starting quarterback has done the last few years at Alabama for each head coach. So talking specifically about Kalen DeBoer here, and then the offensive play caller, who in this case is Nick Saban, who wasn't with DeBoer in 2021. That's why he was with Michael Penix, and DeBoer wasn't when DeBoer was there at Fresno State and Sheridan was at Indiana with Michael Penix. So you can see that. You can see it based on rushing numbers, running back 1, running back 2, quarterback rushing totals, wide receivers as well, again, for the team itself, the head coach and the coordinator. And then we give projections at each of those spots defensively also. But then here at the bottom, that's where you're going to see player projections and where these come from. Right now, we just have it listed at, as QB1, not Jalen Milroe. We'll put all the names in there a little bit later. But as you can see here, we do have college fantasy football per game projections for 6-point passing touchdowns, 4-point passing touchdowns. We also have PPR and half-point PPR projections for running backs, wide receivers, the number 1, number 2 projected on the depth chart at both positions, and then top tight end as well. And the Jalen Milroe projections, what sticks out. I was curious to see, okay, how does Kalen DeBoer's history and Sheridan's history as well, because he gets thrown into the mix, what does that do as far as what we expect from Milroe's passing numbers? And this is going to be quite a high projection. This would be top 10 quarterback based on last year's numbers, roughly what Dylan Gabriel and Caden Salter did in a 6-point passing touchdown league. Those are the top 2 quarterbacks in CFF drafts at this point. And our numbers think that Milroe is capable of that, if not a little bit more. So again, just a sneak peek here. These will change, but Alabama has been updated, and we'll have the rest of these available in mid-July. So get back to that win total projection. And honestly, I forgot to check what is Alabama's current preseason win total according to DraftKings, which is just who we out of habit refer to. 9.5, plus 120 on the over, minus 140 on the under. As you could see, I'm sure we are under. And that's been pretty consistent for most of the teams we've talked about in the top 10. Our traditional win total projections have mostly been successful. I've been comfortable with how things shake out as far as wins and losses. We were 60.4% since starting this in 2021, 55.6% last year when we do a win total projection over or under on every FBS team. And you can see that we're clearly on the under for Alabama. Shouldn't be a surprise. We're on the low end as far as our projections go. But do I really think that Alabama is going to go 8-4? Me personally, I don't. I think it's quite possible that we are underrating Alabama. I'm not sure I'm fully on board with Alabama as a top 5 team, but being double digits, being 10th in those power rankings, that just seems low. And it is. It's lower, as we said, than any other outlet that we compared ourselves to. So maybe we're able to capture something a little different. Maybe the way that we adjust for experience and production and go player by player, position by position. Our numbers are somewhat unforgiving in terms of a team like Alabama that maybe has earned, rightfully so, the benefit of the doubt. Numbers don't offer that. So maybe we could end up looking a little smarter on a team like Alabama. Maybe we'll end up looking really, really dumb for projecting this team that has been so well established to take a step back like this. But as you can see, game by game, we do have the Crimson Tide as underdogs against Georgia, against LSU. oddly enough, against Oklahoma, which probably not a surprise since we previewed Oklahoma last week as a number 7 team in our power rankings. We're on the high side for the Sooners. But Alabama is going to be tested in some other games as well. We have the Tide less than a field goal favored against Wisconsin, less than a field goal against Tennessee, 5 points against Missouri, and still, single digits, kind of in the range of what we're used to seeing, nearly 10 points, but not quite there in the Iron Bowl against Auburn. So is Alabama going to end up making us look quite silly? We shall see. We do have a sort of updated look at win total projections that we are sort of testing this year, because we have been, under just about every, top 10, top 15 team. We're going to be over just about every bottom 10, bottom 15 team, trying to give a little bit clearer view on the edges. So give a 10% bonus for every game a team is projected as the favorite, according to our numbers, a 10% penalty for every game in which a team is projected to be an underdog. Use that sort of in a similar mode to these projected win percentages game by game, where they get Alabama, gets assigned 0.92 wins for its projection against Western Kentucky, 0.92 wins for its projection against USF, 0.55 against Wisconsin. Add them all up. That's where the 8.16 gets. But Alabama gets a +6, being favored in 9, underdogs in 3. So we add 0.6 wins to that win total, gets us up to 8.76, which would round up to 9. 9 and 3 seems a little closer to right, but still under that 9.5. So we see Alabama taking a clear step back as far as our projections go, but I absolutely understand why this program as a whole, largely based on how well it has recruited high school players consistently at or near the very top in every position, understand why this team, most probably see it as too talented to fail, too talented to take a significant step back. Bruce Feldman had Alabama as the number 9 seed in his most recent college football playoff predictions. That seems about right. A 9-win Alabama team probably is going to have an opportunity to play for a national championship in that updated, expanded college football playoff. But perhaps this team, kind of similar to last year, with so much turnover on the coaching staff for the first time in a long time, 94th in returning production. Maybe this Alabama team at the end of the season is going to be much, much better than it will be at the beginning, much like last year, and have an opportunity to play its way into a national championship game where they came up just a few yards short last season. So I'm not super opinionated one way or the other. I absolutely understand why some people would argue that our numbers are disrespecting or underrating Alabama. This team certainly could overachieve based on our projections, but also maybe we're able to just gauge it a little bit better in some ways, and perhaps this team is more in danger of taking a bigger step back than a lot of folks expect. So that's going to do it for us today with our preview of number 10 Alabama. We'll be back on Wednesday to preview number 11 LSU. We have Michigan at the end of the week, and then we will be shifting our schedule just a touch the following week. We're still going to do 3-team previews, 3 shows, but probably in a slightly different per day schedule or daily schedule. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for liking this video on the Campus to Canton YouTube channel. Thank you for subscribing to the Campus to Canton YouTube channel. And of course, thank you to those of you who've been willing to subscribe to CampusToCanton.com, whether you are a walk-on scholarship member, the lowest price tiers where you can join for as little as $2.99 per month, or if you're joining us all the way up at the all 22 or C2C Winning Edge level, we greatly appreciate it. Everyone, I hope have a wonderful Monday. We'll be back on Wednesday to preview LSU on episode 61 of Good Morning College Football. I'm Nicholas Ian Allen of CFB Winning Edge, campus2canton.com. Have a great day and take care.